So let me introduce
Okay.
today Meg Ross. Thank you, Reverend Ross, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's a blessing, and I think it's something that we have been looking forward to share a bit more, especially in the midst of where we are, all of us in this moment, in our personal history, in with our congregations, as lay leaders, as priests, as bishops. There's something that comes across and is a loss and grief, and how we deal with that, and how we are experiencing that in our midst. So, and you come up with this background of dealing with exactly this with priests, with lay leaders, with students as well. So thank you for being with us and the opportunity to share all of that experience with us. And I invite you to take it from here now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. And I first want to say welcome. And I'm so pleased to be with all of you. And already I'm experiencing the loss of us being in a room together, where I would be able to shake your hand and look you in the eye and welcome you, and we could all be a community together. So we're doing that. I don't say virtually, we're doing it at a distance today. And I'm really pleased to be with you. Victor mentioned I had many years of working in a ministry of working with people who are grieving and are working through loss. For many years, I was a hospital chaplain. For many years, I taught clergy and lay leaders about pastoral care. I still do that. And I'm currently, my ministry is as a psychotherapist, I teach at Union Theological Seminary, I'm a clergy coach, and I do things like this, which is lead groups and work with people across the church. And my home parish is Grace Nyack. It gives you a little bit about me. So I'm going to now put on my glasses so I can see my notes and see you all better. And there might be a little glare, but I'll be able to see you better. So as I began to prepare for today and to think about this time where the entire world together is grieving and going through a loss. And I thought, my goodness, I don't know when the entire world has been going through such a loss, except for maybe 100 years ago, the last pandemic. And as I was thinking about that, I remembered that my own family was highly impacted by the pandemic of 1918, 1919. So while today I'm going to share some basic information about grief and loss and healing, and then leave time for us to discuss and ask questions and share our experiences, I want to share with my own experience, my own family's experience. And I'm hearing this secondhand, but my grandmother grew up in upstate New York on a farm. And in those days, the farms were, they were 10 miles from town, but that was enough distance that you had to, if you went to secondary school, as they called it, you had to board in town and take a, horse and wagon into town and come back on the weekends. So she boarded in town and went to secondary school. And in the winter, January of 1919, someone came and got her and brought her home. And by the time she reached the farm, her mother had died of the flu and her grandmother had died. And they died the same day within minutes of one another. And she also came home to find that her father was also deathly ill. Now her father recovered and he lived to his 80s. And I never, of course, met any of these people. But in my family's history is this, just this grief, this generational grief that can be caused by a pandemic. The sudden loss, the loss of a generation. The loss impacted my grandmother the rest of her life, of course. She didn't talk about it much. She was one of those people, and maybe some of you come from these kinds of families, where the way you deal with grief is you get on with it. She was a farm girl, you get on with it. She went back to school in 2 weeks, and my sister has a report card. She got straight A's for the rest of the semester. So the way she grieved was getting back to work. And that's how she grieved the rest of her life. And she wasn't very open to other methods of grieving. So that's one side of my family. So you might take a moment and just think, what is the way that your family has taught you to grieve? Is it the getting on with it? Or is your family a family that comes together and mourns and weeps and wails together? Which is another way of grieving. There's so many different ways of grieving losses. And I do want to note that as we talk about loss today and grief and all that is coming with COVID-19, it may also bring up other losses in your life. So be gentle with yourself and give yourself space. And let's remember that the Holy Spirit is indeed with us today. So I want to start with looking at just what is loss and what is grief. And remembering that loss creates an emotional and a spiritual wound. So you can think about a wound as a cut in the skin, literally an opening. And grief and loss causes that opening in us. Open in our emotions, opens us up, opens us spiritually. It's wounding. And that mourning and grieving are the process by which we heal that wound, the way we heal the wound. And you can think, having worked in hospitals for years, maybe some other of you have, that if you have a puncture wound, a deep wound, the last thing you're supposed to do is cover it over. It needs to breathe. And if you have a wide wound, it needs to be brought into size so it can heal. And it's not so dissimilar with our losses. Some of our losses need to breathe a bit. Some of them need to be absolutely not covered over. So if we think about loss as a wound, then we can think about grieving and mourning as actually a way toward healing. And in this time, we know the losses are tremendous. So grief then, we can think about as that internal experience of loss, and mourning as the external manifestation, how we as individuals, as a church, as a collective, work through those wounds. And also very much thinking about grief as something that is embodied. It's not surprising that we talk about a broken heart. We're talking about the weight of grief. Our bodies feel grief. Our bodies know it. We know grief. We know loss in our bodies. Certainly not a disembodied experience at all. So if we think, let's take a moment with loss, and in this time, there is certainly the ultimate loss and loss of life. Now, I don't know that any of us have not been touched yet by the loss of life, whether our families or our churches or our communities. And then we know throughout life, there are so many different types of loss. And I want to name some of those just to remind us. And I know a lot of this will be not new to any of us. We all have lived full lives. We know loss. But when we think about loss, we think about the full breadth. The loss of life, certainly. The loss of jobs, huge at this time. The loss of safety. The life as we knew it, when we could hop on a bus, get on the subway, go to church and give someone a sign of peace with a shake of a hand, hug our friends and relatives. Huge losses. And then, of course, there are all kinds of losses around hopes and dreams. Since I do a lot of work with people of all different ages, I'm hearing with young people the loss of their dream of beginning a career, having the weddings this spring. Those are done. Graduations, virtual. Who wants a virtual graduation? Right? Virtual birthday parties. Right? The loss of new beginnings. Right? So on and on, those social losses. And then there is the the loss of just the world as we knew it, not knowing what the future brings. And none of this is new to COVID-19, but all of it is being brought up by this particular crisis. So as I give the information, I encourage you to begin to think about what are your experiences. So when we move to the discussion, you can kind of been collecting some of your own experiences, your own questions as we go along. Now, of course, as Christians, we are so fortunate to have a faith that teaches us that we have a God who came down in flesh, knows the human experience, and overcame death. That is something we can rest on. It does not take away the pain, but it is something we can absolutely rest on. So I want to then take a minute to look at what are some of the signs of grief and loss that we might be seeing in ourselves, certainly in the members of our parishes, in our own loved ones, that we want to be paying attention to. So we think naturally about the emotional signs of loss, sadness, right? That expressions of grieving, of fear at times, right? Of hopelessness. And remember also, with grief doesn't just come sadness, often comes irritation and anger. Why me? Right? Why us? Why now? So there's loss, there's the experience of sadness, there's also the experience of anger. All of this completely normal. Then, of course, are the spiritual signs of grieving. You know, for some, it's a real loss of faith. I'm sure all of you have wondered, where is God in this? Where is God in this? Others will find a renewed faith. You know, God is the only thing getting me through. In my years as a chaplain, I've heard both of those. How could God be doing this to me? And God is the only one who's helping me survive. And all completely natural. Then there are the physical signs of grief. And some of them are, a colleague of mine said, your brain won't work the same way. Brain won't work like normal. And there's really something to that. Our brains, you know, can get muddled. Can't think straight. Say, what's wrong with us? No, totally normal. You may literally feel weakness. I once had a sudden loss and my knees gave out under me. My legs gave out, like they, you know, you hear in the novel, the person didn't faint, but literally my legs got weak. You know, our bodies may feel weak. We may feel tired. And all physical signs of loss and grief, completely natural and normal. And one really important one is the inability to sleep. Either can't wake up, sleeping too much, or not sleeping enough. So again, as those things, be thinking about yourself, be thinking about your loved ones, be thinking about the people you work with in your parishes. You know, are you seeing these signs? All natural and normal. And then, of course, are the social signs of grief. And this is what's so hard, right? That we can't come together and do our grieving together, right? But some of the social signs of grief are kind of two sides of the coin. One, those people that I want to be alone. I've got to cry it out alone. And those who say, I cannot be alone. And right now, people don't have a lot of choice with that one. Right? They're either stuck in the house, in the apartment with people, they can't get alone time, or they're stuck alone and they can't be with people. So some of those natural, normal ways of dealing with grief are, you know, hard to come by. And then, of course, the other one, which can be both a positive and negative, is humor. I have never laughed so much, I don't think, as a Facebook post over COVID-19. And I'm saying, what is it? Why am I laughing? It's a time of horror. But some people are really coping with this with humor. And other people are using humor to escape. So it's balancing that, right? Is it escape? Is it helping us with our mourning and grief? Only we know what's working for us. So let me take a minute with types of loss too, because there's so many different types of loss we're experiencing. One is what we call anticipatory grief. That's the grief we have when we know a loss is coming. It can happen in our families when someone has been diagnosed with something and we know that grief is coming. We know that loss is coming. And we begin to do the process of grieving ahead of time. And I think now we don't know what the world will be, and there is some anticipatory grief. What will it look like when we can gather again? And what changes will we have to live with? So there's an anticipatory grief. Then another type of grief, of course, is the sudden loss. And this can be so hard because there is no preparation. And as we know, many people are experiencing sudden losses now. Loss of life, loss of job, loss of meaning, sudden losses. There's what we call a complicated grief. And that is the grief that has many different aspects to it. And I certainly think that this time is leading to a very complicated grief. And it's one of the hardest to heal and needs particular attention. A suicide might be a complicated grief, right? Where there is both sadness and there may also be anger, there may be guilt. Very complicated to handle all of that at one time. And with this pandemic, it's very complicated as well. Some people are doing okay. Some people have tremendous losses. Some people are clapping for the heroes and getting through. Some people are in despair. And everything in between. It is complicated. And I think the other piece is I'm hearing guilt from people. And I want to bring this up particularly with you as lay leaders. Because so often those of us in leadership think I should be doing more. There must be something I can do. As parents, we should be shielding our children from this, right? Why can't I go and see my 90-year-old mother and protect her somehow? I should be able to do more for her. So we have to pay attention to that guilt that can come up as well. And then the last type of grief, and I'm sure there are many more, but the kind of is what we call ambiguous loss. When there is no closure and there's no clear understanding. And we're certainly in the middle of that too. We do not know when this will end. We do not know what losses are ahead. And it is very hard to understand. The thing that gives me hope is actually going back to my grandmother, knowing I don't know what she lived through, but she lived through it. You know, the world lived through it. And that gives me a certain sense of hope, even though I don't know what we are living through or what we're going to go through or are going through. So then, as I've talked, you might notice that some of the losses I've talked about were individual losses and others are communal losses. And so for us as a church, I want to focus a little on the communal losses, right? That we are absolutely, we can't be going through this alone. We're going through it as a world, but losses in communal losses can be huge, that one loss can build on another. So a community that is having one loss of life and another, it builds. Right? If you have a number of people in your parish who are losing jobs, who are fearful, that it builds and it becomes a communal sense of loss that needs to be held as a community, needs to be healed as a community, and needs to be understood as something that even if individuals are not feeling it alone, that our community is feeling it. So there are times when the community may be in line with what we're feeling, the church, and sometimes what's going on in the parish may feel very different from what we as individuals are feeling. And now we have the particular challenge of how do we know what the community is going through, right? How do we check in and get a sense of the communal loss and grief? And I have to tell you, I'm going to tell you my age, I'm 62. And I was shocked when I got a call for the elderly. They were calling all the people, the elderly people in the congregation. They called me up. I thought, what, me? I can take care of myself. And then I thought, wait a sec, how wonderful that I got a call to see if I'm okay. You know, so I went from feeling, oh my gosh, I'm not elderly, to the community was concerned about me and reached out. You know, so great. Great. There's so many ways that we can reach out to one another. And some people may rebuff you a bit like I did. What, me? and others would be so relieved. And then I got on board and was relieved and gracious eventually. And I realized I was an elder. An elder, notice, not elderly. Okay. So, so many ways we can reach out, and we need to reach out to find out what the individuals are going through and what the collective community is going through. And I think as a church, we have to also see that we are also wondering and grieving our future. I mean, think of the grief we went through around Easter. Did anyone here grieve Easter? Not in the church besides me? Oh my goodness. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a rabbi who was talking about the Passover meal with his small family of 3 instead of his extended family of 30. And I said to him, listen, Easter is not a solitary celebration. We do it big, we do it loud, we do it with smells and bells. This is not something we want to be doing in isolation. Huge losses. So then we begin to think, how do we as a church move forward from these communal losses and grieve communally, and not knowing what actually we're coming back to as a church, when we're coming back to it, and what our church and our community are going to look like. We just don't know. And that is common with all losses. We can't see the other side. We've got to go through this process of mourning and grieving so that we can get to the other side and discover what's new, So although not all of you are clergy, I know that I want to speak to some of the losses of the clergy, if you're lay leaders who are working closely with clergy, and tell you some of the things I'm hearing that you may also identify with. But some of it can be like a loss of identity. Like the things that I do weekly, daily, I can no longer do. I can't provide for my parish. I can't preside over the Eucharist, something that gives me life and is a way that I feed and care for my people. And you may be feeling that as priests, those of you who are lay leaders may be feeling that as lay people. How do I care for my community during this time? A loss of identity can be a loss of spiritual strength. I hate to even mention it, but some people are feeling a loss of spiritual strength, lay or clergy. And then again, others are saying, this is, my goodness, my God is with me in a new way. And can be a loss of ability to use one's gifts and skills. Like I said, for me, I'd much rather be with you in person. Right? I could be walking up and down, could have a conversation more while I'm talking, we'll get to that, but it would be a different presentation. That loss of being with one another. So our clergy are feeling that, you as clergy may be feeling that, and you as lay leaders. The gifts and strengths that you have may feel thwarted in a real time of loss right now. So I want to take a minute then and think about myths about grieving so that we can undo the myths, so that we can, as individuals and community, to grieve well. So one myth is that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. Now, I think that was, as I said, kind of the myth in my grandmother's family. You get back to work and the pain will go away. Now, for some people, getting back to work is a great healing method, which is why it's so hard for some people, they can't get back to work right now. But it's not about ignoring it. Ignoring it does not make it go away. As I said, if you think about a wound, it needs to breathe. There needs to be a way to express the feelings, to have a community support you. So this myth of just forget about it, move on, doesn't work. There are a lot of ways to grieve, but ignoring it is not one of them. Then there's this other myth about be strong in the face of loss. That is the thing, you gotta be strong. And that crying is weakness. And especially as leaders, you can't let everybody know that you're falling apart. No, we're all human. Leaders are not. We cry, we grieve, we fall apart a bit. One of the things that has been a gift to me is that some of my mentors over the years have allowed me to care for them. They cared for me, and now I could care for them. So for us as leaders, we want to know, are we allowing others to care for us when we need it? Are we allowing ourselves to fall apart of it? And know that that's okay. Holding it together is not the only way. And then there's the opposite side, the myth that if I don't cry, that I'm not feeling the loss. I was leading a group just last week, on Zoom, of course. And one member said, every day I'm crying about the deaths in New York, about the losses in my community, about what's going on in my church. I'm crying every day. And then another person said, oh my goodness, I haven't cried once since this began. Maybe there's something wrong with me. No. There are those of us who cry it out and those of us who don't. And those of us who find one day, all of a sudden the tears come. And it's really important for us to make space for those different types of grief in ourselves, in our communities. Another myth is that grieving has a certain lifespan. Often people say if you're grieving a death, you have 1 year and you get on with it. How can grieving have a lifespan? It's different for everyone. But I do think about my Jewish friends and colleagues and the Jewish mourning rituals that are so strong. They have the ritual, you know, that for a loss of a close family member, and they have it just explained exactly who's a close family member. You only sit Shiva, which is 7 days in the house for close family members. You stay home. People come to you. They feed you. They bring sweet things so you can taste the sweetness of life again. You might rend your clothing, and you only talk about the one who's deceased. And you do that for 7 days. Just very prescribed time of grieving. And then at the end of the 7th day, you literally walk out of the front of your building and walk around the corner. And then you start your year of mourning. But there's the idea that you grieve for a period and then you open your life again. And then they have a year worth of prayers. And then that time ends as well. Now, it's not that we have 7 days for this loss and a year for that loss. But I think there's something really wonderful in this idea that we can come together, and we have to find ways to do that at this time, for really difficult losses, and just stop everything and allow people to care for us. And then we come out of that and we go to the next phase of life and we find out what that is. And as a church, there are members of our congregations that need that just caring. They've had huge losses. And then they'll need a period of time, as will we, to move on to the next phase of life. Continuing the mourning, but move on to the next period of life. And we don't know how long that takes. And some losses, of course, that is a lifetime. The loss is so huge, it is not over. It changes, but it's not over. So the last myth is that moving on with your life means forgetting your loss. And of course, that's not true. We can remember our losses and get on with life. And there are many sweet ways of remembering losses. So I want to take a minute to talk about the myths that are not true, and then take a minute with unhealthy grieving. Because we do want to keep an eye open for either for ourselves, our loved ones, or members of our parish, that where there is grieving that is not as healthy as it could be. Right? Grieving is a normal part of life. Grieving is healthy. And occasionally it moves into something that isn't healthy. So when mourning, sadness, becomes a deep depression, then it's moved into an unhealthy grieving. Now, it doesn't mean it's not appropriate grieving, but it may be a grieving that now needs some extra help so it can move into the healthy phase. Right? When sadness moves to complete despair that is sinking a person, if that is for a period of time, makes sense. If it's for a prolonged period of time, the person may need extra support to continue the journey of healing. If anger moves into rage and acting out, again, might be appropriate in a sense, but that person is going to need extra help to get to the healing phase. To be angry, appropriate. Be in a rage that can't be contained, help is needed. So again, another natural thing is for some people wanting to be alone. But then when the person wants to isolate and is shrinking in their isolation and is removing themselves from healthy relationships, again, that's a kind of grieving that needs some extra attention. And then on the opposite side, when someone has a need for companionship and people to be with them, great. But when a person can't be alone and they're holding on for dear life and they're afraid to be by themselves, a grief that needs some extra care. And then when there are just some specific mental health issues, whether it's addiction issues, whether it's eating disorder issues, whether it's anxiety that can't be contained, depression that can't be managed, those things tell you, okay, now we're in the realm of mental health. We need some extra help. A bit of all of this completely natural. Saying I want to be alone, or I'm depressed, or I can't be alone, or I'm going to eat all the sweets I want for a while. A bit of that, completely normal. When it is prolonged or it deepens and it becomes intractable, then we know there's some extra needed, some extra help needed. So I want to talk about the tasks of mourning again, and then I want to get to resilience and healing and then open it up. So some of the tasks of mourning, which I've already been talking about, one is accepting the reality of the loss. And this may be a lifetime of work. And it is particularly tough in these times because the losses are ongoing. I mean, my heart sinks when I hear the people who have died. My heart sinks when I hear the number of people unemployed. My heart sinks when I hear the injustice and the disparity in the have, people who are doing all right, and those who do not have. But accepting the reality of this is part of the mourning and grieving. Taking it in emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. Walking through the pain and grief. This is what I've said. Not get away from the pain of the loss. A wound hurts. And it hurts for a while until it heals. Then we have the stage of learning to live with the loss. Right? Accepting it, going through the healing process, and learning to live with it. And again, we don't know what we know the people we're going to have to learn to live without. Some of them we know, some of them we don't yet know. We don't know what we're going to learn to live without as a community, as a world. And then the last phase is this reinvesting emotional and spiritual energy so that we can bring whatever we have encountered into a new life again, into new life. And there are people in the process of mourning who are real doers. They've got to do something. So again, when that grandmother I told you about, when she died, my father wrote a book about her life. He had to do something. When my father died, I could not have written a book if they'd paid me millions of dollars. I'm not a doer in grief. So some of us are going to want to do, and some of us are going to want to be. And either way works. Okay, so we know that people grieve differently. We know that there are rituals that are different for the individual, and that there is no one right way. So let's take a minute to switch to resilience and healing. So resilience is, thank God, a wonderful part of the human experience. I mean, we are, as a collective, incredibly resilient. I mean, you could pause and think for your own self what you have gone through in life and what you've gotten through, right? And if some people told me the things I was going to have to go through earlier in life, I would have said, I could never manage that. And I've managed. And I know all of you have had those experiences. And here we are. We're still going. We've all had tremendous losses. People we've lost, hopes we've lost, things we wished for and dreamed for that didn't come through, on and on and on. And our loss is, we have physical resilience. Our bodies are able to overcome all kinds of wounds. We have emotional resilience. We have incredible spiritual resilience. And as a church, this is where our strength lies. We can come together as a church and worship and weep and grieve, and we have incredible rituals for that. And we are resilient. And it's such an important time when we move with our grief to not to cover over the grief, but to begin to look for signs of resilience. And I think we can say one right here. We're coming together on Zoom. We didn't say, okay, we can't meet. Here we are. Here we are. We're looking for ways to move forward. We are resilient people. And there will continue to be losses, and there continue to be ways that we can keep our eyes open for resilience. So I want to pause there